If you're here in our welcome time, you will have participated in a little activity I had you do, and I'm curious as to just who we have in our congregation here. We're talking about where you are in the birth order of your family. So let's just look around. Who here are firstborns? You are the first of your family. And I'm seeing some faces like, yes, I was. I've got stories to tell you. All right. Who here, the responsible firstborn, the firstborn that had the parents practice their parenting on you? That's the firstborn, yes. How about the youngest? Who here are the youngest child? And you might have some side eyes from the rest of the congregation. Oh, that youngest child, where everybody is spoiling that youngest child. My oldest brother says to my youngest brother, you had completely different parents. They just treated you so differently than they treated us. And what about the middle child here who gets overlooked in the middle of the eldest and the youngest? We've got some middle children here. Yes. And you only child, we think of you too. Are you here? Do we have any only children here? It's okay. You're okay if you're the only child. You're part of this family. But if you grew up with siblings, we've talked a little bit about this before, because if you've grown up with siblings, you might recognize some of the themes that we've been seeing in the book of Genesis. Some challenges between siblings, some sibling rivalry. This weekend, am looking after the dogs of Pastor Walter. And this is Tucker and this is Cooper. And they are adorable. But they also are slightly sibling-like. If I reach down to pet Cooper, Tucker will jump on me. Give me attention now, he is saying. It is very difficult to do one thing for one child or dog and not have the other one say, but what about me? There's a story I came across not that long ago that was a little bit shocking to me about sibling rivalry taken to the next level. This is a picture of a building. If you can kind of see on the picture to the left, it looks like it's just a wall, right? It's like this thick. And then the picture to the right, the building kind of broadens out. So in its narrowest part, it's like maybe 3 feet. And then it grows out to being 14 feet on this side. And you might notice on the picture on the left that there's a beautiful ocean view. Do you see it? This building is called The Grudge. It's a building in Beirut, in Lebanon, and it was built in the 1950s when two brothers got 2 plots of land from their father. And there was a bit of a quarrel about who would get what part of the land. So the brother in the back got more land. And the brother in the front thought, all right, fine. You can have more land. I will just build a wall right in front of your view. So all of those buildings in the back, what they look at is a wall. The Grudge. You know, we chuckle at stories like this, but family conflict, family grudges, family dynamics, they run deep, don't they? I remember watching, was it a month ago or so now, the funeral of the Queen of England and her grandchildren. And I remember the pictures that were shown about the two boys who had lost their mother 25 years ago, and following after her funeral parade, they had lost their mother, but they were so close as siblings. And now, 25 years later, they're walking after their grandmother's funeral parade, and they've lost their grandmother, and from reports, there's deep conflict between them as well. And this sense of a loss of something so close and so dear. When you hear stories of dysfunctional families, they run deep. The betrayal of a family is so hard. There's a story about an oil tycoon by the name of Paul Getty. If you're familiar with the name Getty. And I hadn't heard this story before. A story of family conflict. In 1973, a 16-year-old boy, the grandson of the then richest man in the world, Paul Getty, was kidnapped in Rome by the Italian gangsters. And they thought they hit the jackpot. And so they demanded $17 million for the return of this man's grandson. But Paul Getty was famous for his stinginess, and he also didn't much trust his grandson. And so when the boy's father called Paul Getty and said, "My son is being kidnapped and they're asking for this ransom," he reportedly said, "I have 14 grandchildren. If I give any money to this group, I will have 14 more kidnappings." And it wasn't until months passed and the kidnappers got more serious and they sent a piece of his ear and a piece of his hair that the grandfather finally said, "I'll pay some of it." And he said, I'll pay $3 million, he said. But the father had to pay him back at a 4% interest. And the child comes back and he's rescued, but it irreparably damages him because his family has said, how much is your life really worth? The tragedy of families torn apart. The story has said that the boy was released at a gas station and he was malnourished and shivering and missing an ear. And after he gets home, he tries to call his grandfather to thank him, but his grandfather doesn't pick up. Stories of families torn apart abound, unfortunately, in our world. And they are in Scripture as well. There's a thread about stories of families torn apart and a thread about families brought together. So I'm going to share with you and take us back before we enter into this final story of Genesis. I'm going to share a bit of an overview about where we've gone so far. Because today's sermon is the final sermon in this book, this opening book of Genesis. And we've gone through, over the past few past few weeks, story after story in this book about how it all began. And so if you want to just try and follow along, if you remember in the beginning of our story, we had 4 great events in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. We start with the story of creation, a story about a God who creates to be God with us, a God who creates and then has plans for us, has a desire to draw into ever closer relationship with us. And then we have the story of the fall and our mistrust of who God is, mistrusting God's power and God's goodness and God's character. And we have the flood, the point to which humanity just gets so bad that we are just destroying ourselves. But we see throughout these moments that God is not abandoning God's plan. And we have God taking a man through the flood and starting anew, and we have God meeting God's people at the Tower of Babel and said, no, not what your plan is. I have a plan. And God's plan is good, and God's plan will be good. So we go from these four great events, and then we slow down and we focus in on a family. We go from God dealing with all of humanity and the early history of the human race to the early history of a chosen people. We talked about Abraham and God calling Abraham out of the blue, saying, I'm choosing you, I'm adopting you, I have plans for you. And we see God bringing new life and new hope to a 90-year-old womb as Sarah falls pregnant and gives birth to Isaac. And we follow Isaac as he grows up and falls in love, and his two kids, Jacob and Esau. We learned about the fact that even when God's promises are delayed, it does not mean that God's promises are forgotten. And last week, in the story of Jacob and Esau, we read into the story of Leah and remembered that even when we can't see God, God sees us. So today, we're at that final section, the final part of the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph. It might be familiar to some of you. If it is not familiar to you, I encourage you to go this week and read chapters 37 through 50. You'll see kind of a shift in tone. This is a slowed down story, and it is a powerful story. There's so much that one could glean from the story of Joseph. But as always, we have to figure out and pick just one thread that we're going to pick up on in this story. And so I'm going to share with you part of the verse that is said at the very end. And this verse that is said at the very end of this story will help guide us through the story of Joseph and his brothers. The story of a family torn apart and a family brought back together and a God that is moving in the midst. So, at the end of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, Joseph says these words, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." You intended to harm me. You intended to harm me. Have you ever experienced someone out to get you? And have you ever experienced, whether it not be a person or just situations where over and over again it seems like someone is out to harm you? I want to set the scene in this story because Joseph of the many-colored coat has people out to harm him. If you don't know the story of Joseph, he is a miracle child. This theme that we see throughout Genesis is picked up again. Joseph is a child born to a woman who was barren. And like we had with Rachel, this is a woman who was barren, and then God opens her womb in the story of Genesis. Like we had with Sarah, like we had with others. Joseph is a younger son. And like the younger son from the beginning of Genesis, there seems to be something special about him. Joseph is a younger son who is favored by his father. And he is a dreamer. You think about the dreams that one might have. Joseph's dreams are dreams about the rest of the family bowing down to him. And you can imagine that this doesn't necessarily gain him friends in the family. We wonder a little bit, perhaps, why God gives that dream. We don't hear in the very beginning of the story that it is God that gives the dream. We just have a dream. In a situation, in a scenario where Joseph is at the last of a long line of siblings, there is a dream that something new is coming. Something is going to shift the old dynamic. In this very beginning of the story, you have a beginning that introduces Joseph and sets the family tensions, which will trigger the action. You hear the power of Joseph's dream, and you hear the brothers that do not like it. It's an interesting dynamic. A father loves this son more than the others. A brother who loves his father, and brothers who are jealous. There's enough in this story to write about the politics of the family. One who loved too much, Jacob, one who is loved too much, Joseph, and one who feels loved too little, the brothers. And so we have harm. If you do not know the story, Joseph has these dreams, and then his father tells him, go and check in on your brothers who are out watching the sheep. And Joseph goes. And when I think about Joseph going to see his older brothers, I'm not sure how much he knew of his brother's frustrations with him. But have you ever seen a younger sibling, or if you are the older sibling, have you ever seen your younger sibling trailing around behind you, wanting to be involved in everything you do? I've seen this with my nieces and nephews. The older siblings are doing something, and my niece or nephew says, please, can I go? I want to be there too. I want to do it too. I want to be part of it. They follow along like a little duckling, wherever their older siblings go. But in this family, it wasn't just annoying. The older siblings found him to be a threat. And so they go to meet. Joseph goes to meet with them, and the older siblings plot. They say, here comes the dreamer. The one who is saying all sorts of things, the one who is disrupting the order of life as we see it. Here comes the dreamer. So let us destroy the dream. And they take Joseph and they throw him in a pit. You intended to harm me. Some had wanted to kill him. The pit is plan B. You intended to harm me. I wonder how Joseph felt in that pit, thrown in it by his brothers. We are going into the holiday season, a time where we talk about family gatherings and family connections, but has there ever been a time when you felt like you have been thrown by your family into a pit? Or are there those you know who might have been harmed by their very family? You intended to harm me. You intended to harm me, but God. Can you hear it? Those two words. You intended to harm me, but God. We're going to see this passage at the very end. But if you know the story of Joseph, just imagine it in the very moments of his life. When do we need a but God? Joseph was betrayed and thrown in a pit. But God. He was sold into slavery. But God. He showed up and worked in a family and then got accused of something that he did not do and was thrown into prison. But God. He was in prison for years and years and years, wondering, God, where are you? What is going on? I have tried to be faithful to you. And he thinks a break is coming. He meets up with two fellow prisoners who have a dream, and God gives him the interpretation to the dream, and he says, just remember me when you go and see Pharaoh. There's a silver lining, there's an open window. Have you had those moments where you thought, oh God, finally, my luck is turning, things are changing? But the person that he helped forgets about him. For 2 years, he remains in prison, wondering, God, when? You intended to harm me, but God. You intended to harm me, but God. But God. God is willing to go as far as God needs to go to bring about God's purposes. This is the key theme throughout Genesis. It is real. The story of human challenge and strife and struggles are real. You look at the stories of Abraham and Jacob, Isaac and Esau, Joseph. These families are challenged, but God is doing something. But God is doing something. And the something brings about salvation, and the something brings about reconciliation. There's a story that I just encountered called the straight story about two brothers who were close, so close growing up. But in their old age, something happened, and they grew further apart until there was a huge conflict, and they stopped speaking to each other for 10 years. They were old. Both of them had health challenges, and the one brother finds out that his brother has suffered a stroke. They live only 260 miles apart, which is from here to, let's say from here to Loma Linda and back 3 times. But this man, the brother, also has had his own health challenges. He cannot really see very well. He cannot really move his legs very well. And so he has lost his driver's license. How will he get to his brother? Well, he decides to go by tractor for 240 miles. The brakes fail. He runs out of food. He's sleeping in the rain. It's a story of a journey that he takes until finally he rocks up at his brother's house and calls his name. And as the two stand together, there's silence for a moment. There's awkwardness for a minute until the brother with the walker looks out and sees the tractor and says, "You drove that to get to me?" And the brother says, "I did." We have in this story here, story of a brother who will go to great lengths to reunite. We have in this story here the story of a God who goes to great lengths to reunite. You intended to harm me, but God intends for good. You intended to harm me, but God intended good. I'm going to go to the passage here. I invite you to turn with me to Genesis 50. The end of this story, and again, if you have not read the story of Joseph, I invite you to go back and read through it, but we are at the climax, the very end of the story. And the brothers are nervous because their father has died, and they wonder, even though Joseph said, I forgive you before, they wonder maybe he was holding on to a grudge. Maybe he's got something against us, and it'll come out now. So Genesis 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died, and we're not sure that he actually did. It doesn't say that he actually did. We're hearing the fears of the brother. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him, bowing before him. This vision that he had had previously, here it is, bowing before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. You intended to harm, but God intended for good. Do we need to hear those words sometime in our lives today? Do we have experiences where we're feeling like some are intending for harm, but we need to know, but God will work it for good. And what God is doing, we have here the story of a single family, knitted back together through this power of forgiveness that God introduces here in the story. But we have here a microcosm of what God is doing for the whole human family. God is knitting back together a broken human family. And what others intend for harm, God will work for good. There's a story I found a couple of years ago about, it's a strange story. This is a model of the city of London that in 2016, to celebrate the 350th anniversary of the fire of London, they burnt the model. And it's a strange thing to celebrate, isn't it? Why build a model of a city and then burn it? They had a festival, there were arts and all sorts of various things, and people might wonder, why would you do that? What exactly are you doing here? But as terrible as the Great Fire was, it was after that the city of London was able to grow and create the city that we know today. It was this fire that enabled the city of London to become one of the great cities over the past 300 years. And so they remembered it. A time of great challenge, but also a time that somehow led to something good. You know, Christians arguably perform the same odd type of ritual when we remember the cross. We know we are not only commemorating the brutal murder of Christ, but we remember the cross. What someone meant for harm, God uses for good. The story of Joseph. If you reread the story of Joseph, you see the working of God in the background. Sometimes it takes a long time to be able to see the working of God. And sometimes we are in families where we wonder, God, where are you? But God is moving. God is at work. God is transforming the very things that we do to try and cause him most harm into our good. I'm going to invite our praise team to join us as we sing the words of ancient words once again. And I'm going to invite you to reflect as we do so on these two words, two simple words that I'm inviting you to take home with you this week. But God. Where in your life this week do you need to hear the words, but God? Where in your relationships that might be fraying do you need to hear the words, but God? God invites us to forgive. God is working towards reconciliation, even when we might not see it, even when those are coming out against us, even when the world seems to be on fire. But God. Let us praise God.